Morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to be part of this conference and to welcome this now more intimate group to a discussion on curbing unconstitutional changes of government. When I shared on Facebook the title of the conference and this session, my father responded that the byword of the conference, enough rhetoric catalyzing an era of concrete action, sounded like a call to everyone to join in coups. But today that will be our topic of discussion, unconstitutional changes of government. A few quick housekeeping details, just so that you're aware of them. Please put cell phones on silent. Please also be aware that this session is also being recorded. So be aware that what you say will be recorded. And during the Q&A, please speak into the microphone so that what you say can be part of the recording of the event. Please also tweet and share using the hashtag #OxAfrica18. I'm going to be very brief with speaker introductions. We have just under an hour, and we want to use that to talk about this issue. Their CVs are all on the website. We have Thompson Chengeta at the far end of the panel. Thompson is a Zimbabwean globe-trotting international law academic, frequently seen between Geneva, Pretoria, Zimbabwe, and here in the UK. He's currently a fellow at the South African Research Chair in International Law at the University of Johannesburg. Rose Wachuka, who's a graduate of Oxford here at Blavatnik, is a constitutional lawyer from Kenya. She's currently the Chief of Staff in the Office of the Cabinet Secretary for Education in Kenya. So she's currently working in a government role. And Mokhtar Kane is another Oxford graduate, former president of the Oxford Africa Society. He's from Mali, and his expertise is in peace and security in the Sahel region. And he currently manages the UK stabilization program for the Sahel. So his expertise is in that region of Western North Africa, the Sahel. My name is Jason Brickhill. I'm the moderator for the session. I was born and grew up in Zimbabwe, then worked as a human rights lawyer in South Africa. Given that my views on coups are unpopular even in my own family, I'm not sure that I am qualified to moderate, but I'm going to do my best to get the views out of our panelists. So we're going to start by just giving each of the panelists to outline a few of their headline points on this topic to get the conversation going. And Thompson, can we start immediately with you?
Thank you very much, Jason, for your introductions. And I would say that today, because of the time limitation, I'm going to focus on 2 points. In particular, the issue of coups and how it relates to the aspect of legitimacy, and how do we understand the aspect of legitimacy in Africa. And the second point, which I will discuss, relates to the international community and regional communities, so to say, and how they relate to unconstitutional change of government, so to say. By way of introduction, I would want to say that until I was the age of 21, already starting law school, I didn't know what a constitution was. Neither did I know what constitutionalism is about. I couldn't, therefore, even understand when you're saying curbing unconstitutional change of government, what that would mean. There is one thing which I knew, though, when I was growing up. I knew poverty. Not poverty as to simply say as an African I'm poor, but real poverty. I knew walking distances to schools on bare feet. I dreaded the winter, June and July in Zimbabwe, in the rural areas, because that was my life, poverty. Dreaming each day or hoping that each particular day I'll be able to find something to eat. So while I didn't know about constitution and constitutionalism, I knew the constitution of my stomach, that it wanted food. I didn't know who to blame or who was supposed to feed me, so to say. Now, the reason why I'm telling this story is to say that when we're talking of curbing unconstitutional change of governments, are we just being elite? Are we really going to the core of the problems that are experienced in Africa? Issues of legitimacy. Is it an issue of technicalities which are in a written constitution, to say if you follow these procedures, you're a legitimate president, which I would want to say legal legitimacy. Is it an issue of functional legitimacy where a government is supposed to provide its citizens what they need, especially the basic needs? I would want to believe probably it's the latter. The way, the norm of constitutionalism, as probably we understand it now, is to think there are certain laws, certain technical laws that governments have to follow for them to be called legitimate, for them to be called constitutional. That's how we've been made to understand the issue of constitutionalism. And usually it relates to political rights. Are they respecting civil and political rights? If, as Jason asked earlier in the question, in the earlier session, a government is failing to respect socio-economic rights, which I think are at the core of the problems of Africa, still that government may find legitimacy. Going to the second question about the international community, which I also explained, I hope I'm still within my time, in 1 minute, is to say that why is it African governments, when we're talking of legitimacy, we are more worried about being approved by the international community, in particular Western countries? After the recent events in Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa, the president, has not been worried about being accepted as a legitimate government in Zimbabwe by doing any sort of campaign. He's not been doing that, and elections are only in 2 months' time. Rather, he's been globetrotting the United Kingdom and other European states to try to convince them that he's the legitimate leader. The question to me, what is the role which the international community or powerful Western states are playing as far as constitutionalism in Africa is concerned? You would know, some of you, that already the government of Britain has already accepted Mnangagwa as the legitimate leader of Zimbabwe. Does that address actually the real problems which we had with Robert Mugabe, the citizen, the little man, the common man in the street? Those will be basically my framework of what I'll be wanting to discuss today. Thank you.
Thanks, Thompson. So you've raised the issue of what is constitutionalism, what should it mean in Africa, and what's the role of the international community. Rose, can we pass over to you for your introductory comments?
Thank you, thank you. I will pick over off from Thompson and take my discussion in two parts. One is the regional placing of this topic, curbing unconstitutional changes of government through constitutionalism and citizen movements within the regional context of the African Union, and then bring it down to the local or national perspectives and how that has played out in different individual countries. The African Union has, of course, the Constitutive Charter of the African Union. And within that charter, they recognize certain freedoms and governance and democracy as key pillars of the Constitution of African states. And so they have gone further because, as you know, since the 1960s, there has been over 200 successful and unsuccessful coups in Africa, with about 80 successful ones. My own country has had one unsuccessful coup in the year 1963. So it's quite a lot. But then the African Union prescribes what actually constitutes unconstitutional change of government, and these are 5 points. So the first one that the African Union lists as unconstitutional change of government is when there's a coup d'etat, right? And then number 2, when a government is taken over by mercenaries. Number 3, when it is taken over by the military or rebel dissidents. Number 4 is when a losing party refuses to hand over power through free, fair, and regular elections. And the last one, which is more controversial because it's happened quite often and we've turned a blind ear, is when a sitting government amends the constitution to extend constitution office. And this last one wasn't in the initial declaration that actually outlined this definition. It's a recent addition to the 2007 Charter on elections, and democracy within the African Union. So within a national framework, I think for me, as Thompson started, it is what is a constitution exactly? Do we understand what a constitution is? Do Africans, citizens, understand what is meant by a constitution? And I'm privileged to come from a country that has spent over 50 years drawing and coming up with a legal framework that we call a constitution. Every Kenyan, I can tell you, understands what a constitution is. And every so often, you will find Kenyans discussing moments in democracy. In 2013, I was privileged to be in Senegal when President Macky Sall won the election against Abdoulaye Wade. And being on the streets, at the time I was serving the presidency of the Global Young Greens, and we were on the streets celebrating that change. And for me, it was the first time I had really witnessed that kind of euphoria, that kind of atmosphere in a situation where a government had, there was a peaceful change of government from one country to the other, because just a few years before then, we had in Kenya suffered not quite a great transition. And 10 years before then, we had the monumental transition from a 24-year dictatorship to what we now built to a constitutional democracy. And if you've been following Kenyan politics in the last few months, you'll know that we had elections in the year 2017. We had the Supreme Court overturn those elections. We had fresh elections. And we had a person declared, the current president declared winner in those elections. And then we had a parallel swearing in by the opposition, the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, I think, who spoke at the Oxford Union yesterday. And so pretty intense moment in democratic governance. And so these two aspects, do citizens in Africa understand what is constitutional, what is constitutionalism, what are constitutional democratic principles? And does the African Union have the right mechanisms to watch over or play watchdog role over specific countries in Africa to say that the change of power in Zimbabwe, for instance, falls under one of the 5 key aspects laid out in the Lome Declaration, or that the parallel swearing in Kenya is an act of treason, or various things. Are we being picky? Are we being selective? As Thompson asked, are we being elitist? Do we understand the concepts to which we speak? And do we understand democracy to be able to place this topic in context? And where are citizen movements? And what is their role? And what is their place? And when citizens choose to change government or to vote, what is the meaning of elections? Are they free and fair? And in instances where we do not have free and fair elections, is that unconstitutional change of government? I dare say yes. So I dare say that in many instances in Africa, we've had a whole lot of unconstitutional change of government, and especially where we are not able to fully prove that elections have been free, that they've been fair, that they've been regular, and that the citizens have been accorded the opportunity to choose their own leaders outside of bribery, outside of coercion, or things like that, the impurities that cloud elections.
Thank you, Rose. A number of really important issues there that we'll try to return to. The role of the African Union, this relatively new instrument that you talked about, the Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which is only a 2007 international treaty. It only came into force in 2012. So is it working? And then some of the domestic variations and the remarkable events in Kenya over the last few years, including the first African domestic court to overturn an election result. A truly amazing event for many of us. So we'll try to come back to some of those things and in the Q&A later. But over to you, Mokhtar.
Thank you. I think I'd like to start the point by saying this is a very ideological debate, because who does define what is democracy in first place? And we do know that the current concept of democracy, or the state we've been working with, it's been inherited or transported to the continent, is also kind of excluded other territorial form base of power and rule that Africa has known to date. And just nicely, which kind of nicely related to what Rosa said, is that again, who defines what is fair and free or fair elections? And just the case of Kenya, I just mentioned, you have the regional bodies such as the SADC, the East African Community and the international community, all endorsing the election. But the Constitutional Court of Kenya coming out and saying, actually, these votes are quite, there have been some irregularities. And I think this again is emphasize the importance role of the EU and SADC and regional bodies in a way that their credibility have been kind of increasingly being challenged, especially in the case of the EU, and also we also seen with the Arab Spring, where the EU Lomé, the African Union Lomé Declaration and the Charter of Democracy, and again an election and good governance has been increasingly challenged. Because who would you support? The Constitution at Thompson and Rose seem to be kind of from the legal perspective. Do you respect the Constitution or do you respect the will of the people? And my main message today and my main point will really be focusing a lot on the role of the people, because my understanding, I'm convinced of that the ordinary citizens were not innocent bystanders when our country descended into chaos. And that's the message I really want to echo today, because we've seen through the country, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, when the masses really wanted to change, they really managed somehow to make it happen. Of course, in cases like Madagascar, you had the masses actually pushing the president out of power and failure to kind of take up and to lead to the process. So my main message today, just to keep it short in the interest of time, because we're going to be going through the details, is just to ensure that we, although as much as constitutionalism and the international community that I mentioned is important, we don't have to forget who the main recipient of this all governance or constitution, which are the people. And as we mentioned, if people do not understand what the constitution is really is about, how they can uphold democratic values and forms of governance. And finally, just quickly to touch lightly what on Thompson, which was already in my introductory thing, was again this kind of a technicality or technical aspect that concerning you touched upon. We've seen so many African countries as well, as we're seeing, a lot of the post-colonial state constitution were kind of drafted alongside with the examples they've had from other places. And in case like Zimbabwe or other many places, Niger, this was actually drafted by autocrat dictators. And if it has to follow a constitution that was written by a dictatorship, I mean, is that really constitutional or kind of liberal to start with? I think the debate is very ideologically led, and I think I would like you just to mention that at the starting point.
Okay, so thank you very much to all of you for your introductory remarks. Mokhtar really kind of looped back to where we began with Thompson on legitimacy, citizens' movements, and what constitutionalism should mean in Africa, and whether the technical definitions of constitutions really suffice to deal with this topic. Before we move to more recent contemporary events, I want to take us back a little bit into the past, because it seems that this is a necessary part of the context, and that's the legacy of freedom struggles in these conversations about constitutionalism and changes of government. A generation ago, our parents' generation would have been sitting around here, for many of us, not talking about how to resist unconstitutional changes of government, but actually how to introduce democratic governance, how still to secure independence in so many African states. And 2 generations ago, that was the case in many East African and West African states. In Southern Africa, freedom came later for many of us. But I want to start there. The Zimbabwean change that happened in, I'll leave Thompson to define it, the change that happened in November was defined as Operation Restore Legacy, a reference to restoring the legacy of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. Thompson, if I can start with you, how have liberation struggles, their legacy, that history, informed these questions of constitutionalism and the response of the continent now to these sorts of events?
Thank you very much, Jason, once more, for the question how the legacy or the history of Africa, I will be using the example of Zimbabwe, but I think it's the same for many African countries, to say that the history of Zimbabwe, when we were saying that we are struggling for independence, when we were saying that we want to self-govern, there are certain principles, certain norms that were already at the international community or viewed as accepted. So my question, when I asked the question at the beginning of my introduction, to say, what do we mean when we say constitutionalism? Is it the same thing to the African state? When we were fighting the liberation struggle in many African countries, the notion that had been developed at the international level was that one of the most important rights that an individual needs to have are civil and political rights. So even when we started making our own constitutions, regardless of our background or what we need in Africa, the idea was to say we need civil political rights as the most important thing. So you find in every constitution in Africa, civil and political rights are at the top. They are immediate. That's what we're saying. We need them now. Civil political, social and economic rights, we have this concept in law which they say they can be given under the theory of progressive realization, to say, you know, when the states will have money, maybe we can be able to realize these rights. Now, I'm trying to question that theory of saying what is really important in Africa when you're talking of constitutionalism. Does it matter really, Jason, coming, for example, to the issue of Zimbabwe, which you were saying, restore legacy? Which legacy has been restored for the ordinary Zimbabwean? The reason I'm pretty sure why many Zimbabweans on the 19th of November last year marched to the State House alongside the army was not because they love political power, was not because most of them have been jailed at a certain point in time. That's not correct. Was not because they love so much to vote. That's not correct. But Mugabe was representing poverty, the suffering which every Zimbabwean was facing, lack of medication in hospitals. That's why people thought, like, with the fall of Robert Mugabe, maybe things will be better. But that's not probably what us, the elite, are thinking. We're not talking of constitutionalism, saying we want to revert things back. We are talking of a government that is accepted at the international level. And whilst the international community accepts a certain government, regardless of what is happening, I gave you a story about my life. Back then, when I was sleeping hungry, Mugabe was the statesman of Africa. When I'm saying statesman of Africa, he was that leader which was accepted and embraced by every European nation. Yet us as Africans, even today, we still see as if legitimacy of constitutionalism can only be measured when a state president is accepted and embraced by the international community.
Thanks, Thompson. Let's move that same question of legacy to the continental level, if we can, with Rose. So we know that the OAU was established to safeguard the preciously won freedom of the African states that in the early 60s had secured freedom, and to strive to ensure that that was the case for all African countries. So built into the DNA of the OAU was this question of the legacy of freedom struggles. How do you think that has influenced the African Union's ability to deal with questions of coups, unconstitutional changes of government, and disputed elections in the modern era?
We've lost it. I don't think that the spirit of the forefathers at independence, and mothers, by the way, because I always see that there were invisible women who were behind freedom in many, many African countries. But I don't think the African Union has kept up to that vision and that legacy. I remember at independence, the most important thing was political liberation. And they said, go ye and seek the political kingdom, and the economic kingdom will follow. But I don't think we've gotten either. And if we disaggregate this to independent African states, for instance, the struggle in Kenya, to start with, was not even a struggle for freedom. Most people think that Kenyans, the Mau Mau, was a movement in search of freedom. It was a movement in search of land, you know. A lot of, Kenyan liberators who went out to war were tired of being pushed out of their home areas, and they were tired of being denied livelihood because white highlands had been set in the most productive parts of the country. And it was a more complex war and a more complex battle in the country, than just mere freedom. But coming back to the African Union, we have the intricacies of the African Union, the division along language lines, and you could see it in 2016 and 17. I spent a great part of my career traversing the African continent. Because Kenya had, put in a bid to take on the chairpersonship of the African Union, and witnessing, those fractions within the continent, the voting blocks with ECOWAS, with 15 voting power, East African Community with a 14 voting power capacity, South SADC with 9, and all that. And just bringing that into a table and wanting to set instruments and structures that work. I'm not saying that the African Union hasn't met some of the most critical areas. I think the APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture, has been one of the most successful in recent time. But in other cases, we still have countries that are now members of the African Union that deny other countries freedom within their own territories. And I do not think that we can sit here and say that that's the model that we want to follow. So in a way, it's very elitist, and in a way, we would be missing the mark if we just focus on the African Union perspective and ignore the domestic perspective. Because again, we have 54 nations, 55 depending on how you're counting, in Africa, and each with its own very peculiar and very unique attributes, and even the equality of states on the at the African Union depends on an array of issues, and so I wouldn't be so quick as to peg the intervention and the sanctification of what is happening in the continent on what is happening at the African Union level, at that policy level. I think the the greatest things that we've started to witness is, for instance, the putting in place of the Continental Free Trade Area, and that will, if implemented properly, impact many Africans, because then we can move from country to country, we can trade with each other, we can interact with each other, because, as it were, we don't know each other enough to be able to ascribe to the principles of one body. Try traveling to Cape Verde, try going to Sao Tome and Principe from Durban, try going to Marrakesh from Madagascar. It's a nightmare. So we do not understand each other well enough to understand how governance at the African Union level, can translate to each individual country on the African continent. But we can draw examples from Zimbabwe, from the courage of the Zimbabwean people to say that, look, you have your utopian principles, but we have the reality that we live on. You seem to understand what political topics you discuss when you're within the closed doors of the African Union headquarters in Addis. But we in Nairobi understand that when there's disease outbreak in the city, when the drainage is horrible, that we suffer, right? That the citizens and the real people on the continent really don't care about a document, about some principles that you flag out and that you parade without really practicing it. And so we have to move down from the high horse and start listening to our citizens and engaging them and wanting to understand what is it that as Africans, African leaders, what is it that we have not given to our citizens? And there's this threat of, further disaggregating the continent along economic lines. And I say this with young people. So we are talking about entrepreneurship, and we are talking about economic growth, and but it's just only a fraction of that. I used to be in international youth activism, and every conference I went to, it was the same people. It means that we are, elevating the discussion to a higher platform and ignoring millions of people, real people, on the African continent.
Rosa, you've drawn out a number of real challenges, especially there have been discussions of Pan-Africanism in yesterday's address. And do we know each other well enough to build a real notion of Pan-Africanism? And on that basis, I want to move to Mokhtar and ask, are there distinctive features in relation to peace and security in the Sahel that perhaps coming from Southern Africa or East Africa, we may not appreciate, and we see through the lens of our own experiences, our own governance challenges? What are some of the distinctive features in the Sahel region?
In the Sahel region, what we have, particularly in the Francophone side of it, is that the legacies, as you mentioned earlier, are quite very different to our brothers in Southern Africa or Eastern Africa. Most in the Sahel region and West Africa broadly, it was not about land. It was basically about trying to get independence. So the sentiment of land-attached freedom struggle is not really strong there. And we didn't also have the settlers' colonialism, such as some in Southern Africa have experienced. But what's really strong and I say specifically Francophone West Africa, is that a lot of the countries have actually inherited a lot of the system from the former colonial master. You can still see that today in a style of leadership of those countries. If we take, for instance, where Senegal or Mali or Guinea or Cote d'Ivoire, it's a very uniquely Francophone thing where you need to have a strong leadership at the top, like what I call an attempt to go towards presidentialism. We have much more where the leadership try to have control over even the executive, and the challenge, the demarcations of limits of power are quite very limited. So that's basically also kind of shape how the masses in this region also react to all the coup instrument, and as well like the overthrow, the regime situations broadly. So in Nashville, what you mentioned there is that the decision is quite very distinct, and as Rose mentioned, is again by trying to understand each other in a much more harmonious manner, and not just act as blocks and blocks and blocks. But what's also quite very important to highlight in this region is that the Francophone area, especially in the Sahel and in West Africa, starting from Togo, has always been a key in actually in the democratic struggle in the region. Even look at the old 1990s, or in the region, it was started with Togo first, with the democratic thing, and then came to Mali and moved on forward. So the countries maintained to kind of create this kind of space of unified ways of struggle, but they still maintain the uniquely distinctive Francophone aspect, which is, I believe, a shame.
Thank you very much. I now am conscious that we're sharing the room with all of you, and I want to open up for questions, comments. Please keep them very brief. We'll take 3 at a time, and just get your essential point or question across. And if it's directed at a particular person, please identify them. Otherwise, I'll offer to the panel to respond. So if I can see any initial questions, comments, pushback, disagreement. Yeah, thanks. Let's take one while the rest of you warm up.
Hi, my name is Abisola. I'm a business manager and also a school governor, so I'm quite interested in education. I'm also a master's student as well. And I just wanted to get both your view, Dr. Chengeta and Rose, on how you think that education plays a role in reaching, especially the masses who are not involved in this sort of discourse around constitutionalism. Because me growing up in the UK and coming from a very disadvantaged background, these sorts of discussion weren't had. And it wasn't only until I came into this sort of environment that I sort of see young children who come from private schools who have had the opportunity to have this sort of discussion. So if we're seeing the elitists in this country having these sorts of discussions, but not those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Could we see that happening in the more disaffected communities in African societies? So it's a bit of a long one, but yeah, I'm sure.
No, thanks. That's a great question. Any other questions at this stage? Otherwise, I'll put the first question to the panel. Okay, go ahead. Why don't we go with Rose first and then Thompson?
Thank you.
Sorry, Thompson. Let's go with Rose first this time.
Okay, thank you. Abisola, I think that's an amazing question. And currently, I'm in the education space and education policy. And education is the heartbeat. It's really the centerpiece of information and knowledge dissemination in any society. When we teach history, the history of our people and the history of our countries to children, it's really important, because then we place identity and we place these things before them, and they're able to interact with them as they grow. So I think that education is really the priority, because it sort of removes you from that pain of nothingness to knowledge of some kind. And I strongly believe that education is the strongest equalizer. I grew up in a humble background in Kenya, and really the only reason I'm sitting here is because I had a chance to go to school. And I had a chance to go to a good school that had a good public school that was affordable, and that allowed me the chance to get various world perspectives. And so I think that if we have a chance at attaining equality and ensuring that our children are empowered enough to understand basic things, but who also have the capacity to go and interact with others, then we must invest in education. A great deal. I think it's really, really critical to ensure that education, that people not only have access, but access to quality education with measurable learning outcomes.
Thompson, can I bring you in on the same question?
Yeah, just to, in addition, to say that when I gave an example in my opening to say that until I was 21, I didn't know what a constitution is or what constitutionalism was all about, even way into my law school. It is because the curriculum in Africa, just as I was saying about the issue of things which we inherited after independence, is that what we need as Africans? So if we go back to the drawing board of like, what is it which we need to learn? What is it which we need to understand? And what does it mean for us? So these, if we are to curb this unconstitutional change of governments which we're talking about, people have to understand again in the beginning what a constitution is and what constitutionalism is about and how that will benefit them. Right now, as you may note in Zimbabwe, when I try to make a discussion about to say Mnangagwa is an illegitimate president, they look at you and say, why do you say that? You say, it's because, the Constitution says this and that. Again, to them, it's nothing, because they're saying, but Mnangagwa is saying he's going to solve our economic problems. So education, you're totally right. It plays a very important role in how we curb these things, but it plays most of what is in the curriculum of that education. Because if we may say education is compulsory for everyone go through primary school, instead of probably of me learning about Pythagorean theorems, which I'm not using now, it may be necessary within the curricula of someone who is going within the primary school in Africa to know what a constitution is, what their rights are, so that when the government is doing something, they already know this is against the obligations of the government. I said in my opening statement, when I was starving, when I was having these problems, I didn't even know that the government has an obligation actually to protect me from that. I'm thinking that is the normal state of affairs. So I'm saying maybe it is an issue of going back to the drawing board and trying to say, what exactly is it which we need in Africa at this particular moment? Right now, we are seated here in Oxford. Sorry to say, it's a very wonderful conference. Again, I think maybe let's say them. Right now, Zimbabwe experienced that unconstitutional change of government. There are no such conferences in Africa. It's business as usual. We discuss here in the UK.
I think we may want to
And
come.
after we graduate, probably we'll write theses which will file somewhere. Information sharing, like how is this affecting our government back home?
Rose, you want to respond on that?
Add a bit more. I think we also need to, hold ourselves back when we suffer the risk of just formalizing education. And I think informal education and traditional means of impacting knowledge within the African context is extremely important. So what role do we play in teaching each other, using folklore, using narratives, using stories, powerful media that passes information on to our children? We have to be careful not to lose that. Again, those are some of the most powerful things that hold our societies together. The passing on of information from one generation to the other using informal platforms. We have to make sure that we don't lose that, because if we do, then we expose millions of our people from truly understanding our identity and our traditions and the values that make us Pan-African.
Mokta, did you want to share anything on the role of education?
Maybe just one point, which is really that it's not, again, in relation to Thompson, it's just learning about the Constitution. It's about, again, understanding which Constitution the Constitution was written, as I mentioned earlier. You have the case, let's say, in Kenya, in the DRC, in Gabon, where you have political dynasties. And if you have those kind of certain political dynasties who have actually written this Constitution, are you feeding through a system? Or we're actually trying to create, to improve a system that will benefit all together. So my emphasis today is just basically to try to understand that it's not just about the Constitution per se, as a technical document that allow regular changes of government through non-violent means. It's again about being liberal, like having actually a liberal constitutionalism, which really entails, again, the rule of law, and again, ensuring that everyone has an equal chance of accessing the system.
And Mokta, I would be very unfair to the Kenyan people if I let you comment about political dynasties and constitution making, particularly in Kenya, go unanswered, because the Kenyan constitution and the Kenyan constitution making process is one of the most participatory in the world. And so the Kenyan people were right at the heart of making that constitution through decades and through moments of intense democratic transition.
And if I can respond, I didn't say the constitutional process in Kenya was not participatory. All I said is that, as evidence shows, it hasn't really shown a radical change at the top. We've seen in Gabon after Bongo and Bongo's son in power, in DRC, Kabila trying to do exactly the same thing. And unfortunately, in Kenya, it's been exactly the same with the two founding fathers and then exactly the country. So I haven't said it hasn't participatory, but it hasn't really helped bring a radical change in the system.
Well, I'm going to pick up from I see a couple of questions. Let's go with you and then you. And I think just wait for the mic, please, so that we can record.
So I'm actually the timekeeper as well. So, so we actually have like 3 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah. But so I wanted to push a little bit back on the education, like the role of education, because I do actually agree and believe in the role of education, but yet I still feel like education alone is actually not enough in terms of actually bringing about the change. And I said that in reference my own country in Uganda, for example, when we had the constitution change, just in last year or something like that. And what I see is we still did see people, the masses, they resisted, the constitution change. But in the end, to me, I feel like what actually mattered was the people that had the power. It's the members of parliament, and I don't even know, who else who decides, to actually, they decided what actually happened. And even what we saw in Zimbabwe, I'm not very, well versed on all of that, but I want to say that part of what we saw in terms of, changing the government was because I want to say those with the power actually complied, they wanted, that sort of, switch of government actually happened. So how do you take that power and actually give it back to the masses? Because I think education is not actually enough to do that.
Okay, I'll take that question there, and then also Phyllis at the...
Thank you all very much. I just want to make 2 comments. One, about the importance of civic education in the curriculum. even at primary level, I think it's very important that you can teach a child about their human rights, and that is an empowering thing. If they understand that when they get older and they're eligible to vote, then they will take that responsibility seriously. So civic education is very important. I've just come from a very interesting education communication conference, which was held in Indonesia, but which had over 100 representatives from Africa. And using the media to roll out nonviolent education, also using the media to roll out participation and lateral thinking and critical thinking is becoming very, very important. It's recognized throughout the South. This conference had representatives from Latin and South America, from every country in Africa, from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and it was riveting, I promise you. So I want us all to think about this kind of communication tool which can be used effectively in the schools and with families to promote better forms of education and constitutionalism. Thank you.
We'll take one more comment at the back. If it's brief, I'll get to you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jack. I'm from South Africa. Well, I agree with the latter speakers when it comes to education and how we perhaps, in fact, I would actually like you guys to revisit her question on how can we then make sure that people understand, you know, in the most remote areas. But part of the things that I want you guys also to outline is what do you think about the, okay, let me rephrase that. I genuinely think that we do not have, I mean, speaking as a South African or as an African, we did not have a chance like I think they are having in Kenya, where everybody else was part and parcel of building their own constitution, right? To an extent that now it's difficult, I mean, from my side, to tell what is unconstitutional, because I was never there when the Constitution was built and made to justify the actions of the current government in this case. I mean, look at, let's go to Zimbabwe for instance. A lot of things that you would hear over TV, radio, or even being there, experiencing them, they will be constitutional. It's only now that some of the things you'll be like, but that was not a constitutional, it was not supposed to be allowed. But according to who? You know, that's the first question. According to who, where did you benchmark that from? Because if you're gonna come and say, let's benchmark a constitution from the Western side of the world, which speaks to the life, you know, the context of living in that area, and doesn't necessarily addresses and speaks to the context of living in Zimbabwe or in South Africa for that matter. So which one is the right and which one is the most constitutional constitution in this case? Because, I mean, constitution is supposed to speak to what I, as a South African, believe, and it must then articulate my living. Just to be brief, another situation I would actually like to, just as I'm extending from that matter, is the inheritance of colonial systems in Africa could also be an issue that we must look at. I mean, as the next generation of leaders, I'm really not at peace with how we have to measure our success, how we have to measure our lives as Africans to the rest of the world, and how we should concern ourselves on whether the current president of Zimbabwe is recognized by the Queen. Sorry if this is offensive, but because now we go back to Africa, we believe in the same monarchy systems, but it's apparently not modern. The only modern system, for example, it has to be the English monarchy. What about other monarchies? I mean, other countries that believe that I don't necessarily have to vote for a leader. I believe that the leader is born and God has given us a leader in this family, and this is what we think things should be. But if then we're going to galvanize people through media, we're obviously going to have all those unconstitutional citizen movements, because people now, you've got two different kinds or many different kinds of people who are galvanized against what they used to believe in and which was working. You understand? So I feel like we need to get deeper. But doing that, we also need to take it back to the people like you guys are saying, and a question to say, okay, let's then have a public participation. What do you guys want? You know, taking also into account the fact that we have a very galvanized community where people now, there's social media, hashtag Mugabe must fall, you know, and then it's a buzz, everybody else is on the streets. So you see, I don't know, can we have, you know, a focused view on these matters? Thank you very much.
I'm going to have to call you there. We're out of time. So these are going to be comments that we're going to have to take forward into our own individual work and lives. I think there's been a really rich discussion. A lot of things have emerged around the lived experience of people and how that needs to inform notions of constitutionalism, the role of the continent, regional variations and domestic variations, and this crucial role of education and civic education in particular around the role of constitutions, rights, and voting. And this question, Jack, I think your comment is a really good place to end in terms of constitutionalism in Africa and the legitimacy of our constitutions. How participatory were the processes? Do those constitutions still hold and represent who we are as people of African states? I want to thank you all for a really interesting discussion. I hope you'll continue to tweet, and we'll see you during the rest of the conference. Thanks very much. If you could please thank the panelists for their contributions today.
So this is this is session 1. It's going to be here, and that is Not Too Young to Lead, a new generation of leaders in party politics and elected public office. And then we have session 2 in room B, which is right around the corner. And then that will be Shaping an Inclusive Business Landscape. And then we have session 3, which is Lifting the Rag on LGBTQ TIAQ. Sorry, I read that wrong. Identity, and that will be in room D, which is by the seminar rooms.